She watched him saddle his horse to leave forever, then whispered 7 words that stopped him in his tracks. Why did those words matter more than the ranch itself? A leather saddle creaked in the cold morning air as Luke tightened the last strap. Frost cracked beneath Naomi's boots when she stepped into the yard. Neither of them moved closer. A packed bedroll hung from his horse, ready for the road, while the wind carried the sound of Iron Creek behind them. Then she spoke, and his hand froze on the reins. What happened next would decide far more than who owned the ranch. If stories like this speak to your heart, stay with us and share where you're watching from. The last week of September settled gently over Bitterroot Valley. Cottonwood leaves drifted across the wagon road like scraps of old paper, and the morning frost disappeared as soon as the sun reached the tops of the pines. Iron Creek Ranch stretched farther than most travelers expected, its weathered fences running toward the foothills until they vanished into pale golden grass. Luke Mercer arrived just after sunrise with a bedroll tied behind his saddle, a canvas tool bag hanging from one side, and little else worth calling his own. He stopped at the front gate long enough to tighten a loose hinge before anyone even knew he was there. The gate had sagged enough to scrape the ground each time it opened. Luke lifted it with one shoulder, drove 2 fresh nails through the iron strap, tested it twice, then continued toward the barn without saying a word. Old Elias Turner watched from the porch. "You fix every gate before you're hired?" the foreman asked. Luke shrugged. "I don't much care for hearing one drag." Elias nodded once. That answer told him more than a dozen references ever could. Inside the ranch office, Naomi Brooks sat behind a scarred oak desk covered with invoices, feed receipts, and a county tax notice folded beneath a chipped coffee mug. The room still carried traces of another life. A heavy work coat hung beside the door. A silver pocket watch rested on the shelf where her late husband had always left it. She stood when Elias brought Luke inside. "You answered the notice from Cottonwood Crossing?" "I did. You know it's only 6 weeks. That's enough. You've worked cattle before?" "My whole life." She waited for more. None came. Most men filled silence because they feared it. Luke seemed comfortable inside it. Naomi slid a folded paper across the desk. "Fair wage, half now, half after roundup." Luke glanced at the amount without counting it. "That'll do." Before either could say another word, voices erupted outside. 3 newly hired cowboys stood beside the bunkhouse with their bedrolls already loaded back onto their horses. One shook his head. "We weren't told who owned this place." Naomi stepped onto the porch. "You were told the pay. We don't answer to a widow." No one moved. A cool breeze stirred the laundry line behind the house. The horses stamped impatiently in the dirt. Naomi neither argued nor pleaded. "If you've decided," she said quietly, "I'll settle what you've earned." One man looked almost embarrassed. Another avoided her eyes. The third simply climbed into his saddle. Within minutes, the dust from their horses drifted across the yard, leaving Iron Creek Ranch quieter than before. Elias muttered under his breath, "We're down to 3 hands now." Luke picked up a post driver leaning beside the fence. "Where do you need me?" Neither Naomi nor Elias answered immediately. He had watched the men leave. He had heard every word, yet he asked only about the broken fence. By late afternoon, the western pasture looked different. Luke had repaired nearly 50 yards of fencing, replaced cracked rails no one had mentioned, reset 2 leaning posts, and patched a loose gate latch using a piece of old horseshoe iron he found in the blacksmith shed. When supper came, he washed his hands at the pump, thanked the cook with a nod, and sat at the far end of the table without joining the conversation. Naomi noticed another small thing. Every worker left muddy boots scattered outside the bunkhouse. Luke lined his neatly beneath the porch roof before going inside. The next several days settled into routine. Before dawn, Luke checked the horses. After breakfast, he rode fence lines. By evening, he fixed whatever had quietly worn out over the years: a loose shutter, a cracked water trough, a broken wagon tongue. No one asked. No one kept score. Naomi found herself watching from the office window more often than she intended. Not because he worked harder, because he worked as though someone else's home deserved the same care as one he might never own. Late one afternoon, a polished carriage rolled into the yard. Samuel Pike climbed down wearing a clean black coat despite the dusty road from Black Rock Ranch. He removed his hat politely. "Mrs. Brooks." "Mr. Pike, I hope business has been kind." "It keeps us busy," he smiled. "I've come with one final offer." Naomi already knew what he meant. Samuel unfolded a leather document case. "I'll purchase Iron Creek, every acre, every building. You'll have enough money to live comfortably in Helena before winter ever reaches these hills. The ranch isn't for sale. It doesn't have to be today." His voice never rose. His smile never disappeared. "A ranch this size asks a great deal of one person." Naomi met his eyes. "So does giving it away." Samuel tipped his hat. Winter has a way of changing people's minds. He returned to his carriage and disappeared down the road. Luke watched from the north fence but said nothing. That night the moon rose late. The air smelled of dry grass and wood smoke. Unable to sleep, Luke walked toward Iron Creek to check the water crossing one last time before turning in. Halfway there, he noticed something. A lantern, far upstream. It disappeared, then appeared again. Someone was moving slowly along the creek bank. Not fishing, not camping, stopping every few yards, measuring. Luke stepped behind a cottonwood tree and watched the faint light drift farther into the darkness until it finally vanished beyond the bend. He remained there long after the lantern was gone, listening to the quiet rush of Iron Creek beneath the stars. Something had begun. He just didn't know what. Luke stayed beneath the cottonwood until the first hint of dawn softened the eastern sky. The lantern never returned. Only the steady murmur of Iron Creek filled the darkness, carrying cold mountain water through land that had depended on it for longer than anyone could remember. By breakfast, he had already saddled his gray gelding. "You heading somewhere?" Elias asked while pouring oats into a feed bucket. "Gonna ride the creek." "You expecting trouble?" Luke adjusted his saddle cinch. "I'm expecting answers." He followed Iron Creek north, through stands of willow and narrow stretches of gravel bank, where deer tracks still marked the damp ground. About 4 miles upstream, he noticed something that hadn't been there a week earlier. Fresh axe marks, recently cut pine logs, shavings still pale against the dirt. He dismounted. Another 100 yards farther, the creek narrowed sharply. A rough timber headgate stretched across part of the channel. New planks diverted a strong portion of the water east through a shallow ditch that disappeared beyond a line of aspens. Luke crouched beside the muddy bank. The wood was fresh. The iron spikes still carried bright hammer marks. Someone had built it within days. When he returned to Iron Creek Ranch, Naomi was checking freight receipts delivered from Cottonwood Crossing. She looked up as he stepped onto the porch. "You found something." "I did." She folded the papers without asking another question. Minutes later, they were riding side by side, following Luke's trail upstream. Neither spoke much. The sound of leather saddles creaking and horses breathing filled the quiet morning. When Naomi finally saw the diversion, she remained still for several long seconds. "That wasn't there." "No. They're stealing the creek." Luke rested one hand on the weathered timber. "They're trying to." "You've seen this before?" He nodded. "I spent a year helping a territorial survey crew in Colorado after I lost my place." "You know the law?" "I know enough to know this wasn't built by accident." Naomi looked down the narrow ditch carrying water away from her land. "They chose daylight. They're counting on nobody stopping them." That evening, after supper, they returned. The moon had not yet risen. Only a thin lantern glowed near the diversion. Two men worked quietly with shovels and fresh lumber, widening the channel one board at a time. Naomi instinctively reached for the reins. Luke gently raised one hand. Easy. He nudged his horse forward. Not fast, not threatening, just close enough that both workers stopped. One man lowered his shovel. The other froze with a hammer still in his hand. Luke never reached for his rifle. It remained in its saddle scabbard where it belonged. "Evening," he said calmly. No one answered. He looked at the unfinished boards. "Long night's work." The older laborer finally spoke. "We're doing what we were hired to do." "I figured." Luke's voice never changed. "You've been seen." Silence settled over the creek. Water slipped around the unfinished gate with a steady rush. The younger man glanced toward the trail leading east, as though waiting for someone else to arrive. Luke noticed. So did Naomi. Neither moved. After a long moment, the older worker laid down his hammer. "We're leaving." The two men gathered their tools, untied their mule, and disappeared into the darkness without another word. Naomi let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You knew they wouldn't fight?" Luke looked at the moving water. "No." "You still rode in. They were hired hands. And if they hadn't walked away?" He was quiet for a moment. Then tomorrow would have been harder for everybody. On the ride home, neither mentioned what might have happened. The stars seemed brighter over Bitterroot Valley than they had the night before. At the ranch house, the kitchen lamp still burned. Naomi disappeared inside while Luke unsaddled both horses. When he finished brushing the sweat from his gelding's neck, the back door opened again. She stepped onto the porch holding a plain tin mug. Steam curled into the cool night air. "I made fresh coffee." Luke accepted it carefully. Their fingers almost touched. Almost. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, while no conversation followed. They stood a few feet apart, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods while the coffee slowly cooled. Sometimes silence carried more honesty than questions ever could. The following afternoon, a government courier rode through the front gate. He handed Naomi a sealed envelope bearing the stamp of the Helena Land Office. She broke the wax carefully. Her eyes moved across the page only once before stopping. Elias watched her face. "What is it?" Naomi handed the notice to Luke. His jaw tightened. Printed beneath the official seal were words neither of them wanted to read. Notice of prior water rights filing. Applicant, Samuel Pike. Any formal objection must be submitted before the 30-day filing period expired. Otherwise, Iron Creek would no longer belong to the ranch that had depended on it for years. The kitchen stayed quiet after Luke finished reading the notice aloud. The only sound came from the old clock above the pantry door. Tick, tick, tick. Elias folded his cap in both hands. "I've worked this creek 32 years, he said softly. "Never thought I'd see paper try to carry water away." Naomi reached for the notice again, smoothing the creases with her fingertips. "What happens if we miss the deadline?" Luke answered without looking up. "Then next spring, every drop that reaches this ranch belongs to somebody else." No one spoke for a long while. Outside, the horses shifted in their stalls as a cool wind swept across the yard. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. "So what do we do?" Luke folded the letter. "We don't fight him with rifles." She looked at him. "We fight him with the same law he's trying to use." The next morning, they left before daylight. Luke carried a leather notebook tucked inside his coat, several sharpened pencils, blank witness statements, and a small bottle of ink wrapped carefully in cloth so it would not break during the ride. Naomi packed biscuits, smoked beef, coffee, and 2 extra horse blankets. They rode first to Miller's Ford. Old rancher Thomas Avery still remembered driving cattle through Iron Creek beside Naomi's father-in-law more than 20 years earlier. He read the statement slowly before pressing his name onto the page. "I've watered stock there since President Arthur was in office," he said. Nobody ever questioned whose creek it was. Luke let the ink dry before folding the paper carefully. One document. Many more to go. By afternoon, they reached Cottonwood Crossing. The stagecoach driver recognized Naomi immediately. "You still keeping Iron Creek together?" "I'm trying." He removed his gloves before signing. "I've crossed that creek every month for 12 years. Another statement. Another piece of history. They spent the next several days riding dusty roads between scattered ranches and lonely cabins tucked beneath cottonwoods. Some people signed immediately. Others needed convincing. Not because they doubted Naomi. Because Samuel Pike owned notes on their cattle, mortgages on their fields, or contracts they could not afford to lose. Luke never argued. He simply thanked them for listening and climbed back into the saddle. Sometimes quiet patience opened doors that anger never could. Near Elk Pass, they stopped beside the camp of a native family preparing for winter. An older man recognized the creek by another name, one spoken long before fences divided the valley. Through careful conversation and respectful translation, he described how the water had always flowed across the same ground season after season. Luke wrote every word exactly as it was given. History belonged to anyone willing to remember it honestly. By the 8th day, Luke's notebook had grown thick with folded pages. Naomi noticed he always stored her signed statements inside an oilcloth pouch before his own belongings. Rain might ruin clothes. It would not ruin the evidence. Late that afternoon, the weather changed. Gray clouds rolled over the Sapphire Mountains faster than either expected. Snow began as scattered flakes. Within an hour, the trail disappeared beneath white. "We should stop," Naomi called over the wind. "We're almost through the pass." A sharp gust answered for her. Her mare shied sideways as loose rocks shifted beneath fresh snow. The horse lost its footing. Naomi slipped from the saddle. She disappeared over the edge of a shallow, rocky wash. "Naomi!" Luke threw himself from his horse before the reins had even settled. He slid down the icy bank, boots scraping against loose stone. Naomi had caught herself against a fallen pine, her left ankle trapped beneath twisted branches. "You hurt?" "I don't think it's broken." "Don't move." Luke knelt beside her. Instead of pulling immediately, he cleared each branch away one at a time. Only when her boot came free did he offer his hand. She accepted it without hesitation. For a brief moment, neither let go. Snow landed quietly across both their shoulders. As darkness settled over Elk Pass, they found an abandoned trapper's cabin hidden among the trees. Its roof sagged slightly, but the stone chimney still drew smoke. Luke gathered dry pine from beneath the porch, while Naomi coaxed a fire to life using cedar shavings left beside the hearth years before. Neither spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary. Luke hung her soaked gloves beside the fire before laying another log across the flames. Later, after she had fallen asleep beneath 2 wool blankets, he quietly placed his own coat over her shoulders when the temperature dropped again. Morning arrived clear and painfully cold. Sunlight spilled through the frosted window. Naomi woke first. Luke was already outside saddling the horses. His coat was missing. She found it folded beside the bed. She slipped it on before stepping into the crisp mountain air. It smelled faintly of leather, wood smoke, and fresh pine. Luke looked up only long enough to see the coat resting across her shoulders. He said nothing. Neither did she. They simply rode home together through the bright autumn morning. By sunset, the familiar windmill of Iron Creek Ranch appeared above the hill. Relief lasted only seconds. A dark column of smoke rose behind the barn. Luke dug his heels into his horse. Naomi followed. The stable roof had already collapsed inward. Neighbors were passing buckets from the well. Elias stood blackened with soot, staring toward the flames. When Naomi reached him, his voice barely rose above a whisper. "We saved the horses." She looked toward the ranch office. "The record room." Elias slowly shook his head. "The fire reached it first." Luke ran inside after the flames had been beaten back. The shelves where land surveys, water records, tax receipts, and decades of ranch ledgers had once stood were nothing but soaked ash and broken timber. Every document they had not carried with them was gone. For several long moments, no one spoke. The smell of wet smoke lingered in the record room. Burned paper clung to the floor in black flakes that dissolved beneath Luke's boots. Naomi bent down and picked up the brass latch from an old ledger chest. It was still warm. "My husband kept everything here," she whispered. "Every receipt, every survey, every agreement." Luke looked around the room once more. Whoever did this knew exactly what mattered. Outside, neighbors helped stack salvaged lumber into neat piles. Someone had covered the surviving tack with canvas before another frost arrived. No one accused Samuel Pike aloud. There was no proof, only silence. The following morning, Luke spread the witness statements across the kitchen table. The papers they had gathered over the past week had survived because they had traveled with him. Elias poured coffee into 4 chipped mugs. "So this is all that's left." Luke nodded. "It'll have to be enough." Naomi carefully folded every statement back into the oilcloth pouch. "Then we don't lose these." For the next several days, Iron Creek Ranch became quieter than it had ever been. The burned stable waited for repairs. Temporary fencing went up. The horses were moved into an older shed near the south pasture. Life continued because it had to. Late one afternoon, Martha Cole arrived in a small wagon carrying fresh bread and 2 jars of preserved peaches. "I figured you folks could use supper without having to cook it." Naomi smiled for the first time in days. "You didn't have to come." "I know." Martha set the basket on the table before glancing toward the blackened stable. "I've been thinking about something." Luke looked up. "What sort of something?" "The old boundary stone." Elias stopped eating. "What stone?" "The one near the bend above Miller's Ford." Elias slowly lowered his fork. "I haven't thought about that marker in years." Martha nodded. "It used to stand beside the old cottonwood stump." Luke leaned forward. "Used to?" "It disappeared sometime this spring." Elias looked toward the window as though seeing the hillside in his memory. "It wasn't just missing," he paused. "It had been moved." The next morning, the 3 of them rode together to the northern pasture. Frost still covered the grass. Martha walked slowly despite her age, stopping several times before pointing toward a patch of ground hidden beneath thick weeds. "It was here." Luke removed a shovel from his saddle. "You certain?" She answered without hesitation. "I buried my husband overlooking that hill. I've walked this path every season since." Luke pushed the shovel into the earth. Dark soil gave way to packed gravel, then stone. Another few minutes passed before the square corner of a weathered marker appeared beneath the dirt. Elias knelt beside it. "I'd know this carving anywhere." He brushed away the remaining soil with trembling hands. The survey initials were still visible. The marker had never disappeared. Someone had buried it and replaced it elsewhere. Luke measured the carved face against the county dimensions recorded in one of the witness statements copied years earlier. They shifted the property line. Naomi stared quietly at the uncovered stone. Months before filing the water claim. Luke nodded. They wanted the map to match the lie. For the first time since the fire, hope returned without anyone saying the word. The marker was carefully wrapped in burlap and loaded into the wagon. It would travel to Helena, along with every witness statement, along with the truth. 2 evenings before the hearing, Luke finished repairing another section of fence just as the sun settled behind the Bitterroot Mountains. He carried his tools into the bunkhouse. Then he rolled his blanket, folded his spare shirt, packed his shaving kit. His saddlebags rested beside the door before dark. He paused only once while looking around the small room. Temporary places were easier to leave if they never felt like home. Outside, Naomi crossed the yard carrying a lantern. She noticed the packed bags through the open doorway. She didn't step inside. She didn't ask where he was going. Instead, she quietly continued toward the house. Luke watched her disappear onto the porch. That silence weighed heavier than any conversation could have. Morning arrived clear and cold. The wagon stood ready for Helena. Elias secured the boundary marker beneath heavy blankets. The witness papers rested safely inside Luke's satchel. Luke tightened his horse's cinch one final time before reaching for the reins. Behind him, the front door opened. Naomi walked slowly across the yard. She stopped a few feet away. Her eyes settled on the packed saddlebags. Neither of them spoke at first. The breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves overhead. Finally, she broke the silence. "Your ranch needs a family," Luke turned. She held his gaze for the first time since he had arrived at Iron Creek weeks before. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe we both do." Luke did not answer right away. The yard stood still beneath a pale October sky. A few cottonwood leaves drifted across the wagon tracks. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse pawed softly at the ground. He looked from Naomi to the packed saddlebags hanging from his saddle. Then he untied them. Without a word, he carried them to the wagon that would leave for Helena instead. It was the only answer she needed. The trip to Helena Land Office took nearly 2 days. The road wound through valleys already touched by frost. Freight wagons rattled past them carrying flour, lamp oil, and winter supplies. They stopped one night at a modest roadside boarding house where the coffee was strong, the stew was plain, and nobody asked unnecessary questions. Luke kept the oilcloth pouch beside him even while they ate. Every witness statement remained dry. Every signature still mattered. When they reached Helena, the land office was already crowded. Ranchers waited with rolled survey maps beneath their arms. Lawyers shuffled papers across worn wooden tables. Clerks called names one after another while the smell of ink and coal smoke filled the room. Judge Horace Whitman entered carrying a stack of property files. He adjusted his spectacles. "The matter of Iron Creek water rights." Samuel Pike stood first. His documents were neat. His survey map appeared official. He spoke calmly, explaining that his filing followed territorial procedure, and that his ranch now bordered the creek, according to the recorded boundary. Judge Whitman nodded politely. Then he turned toward Naomi. "Mrs. Brooks?" Naomi stood. She did not speak for long. "My evidence belongs with the people who lived there." She looked toward Luke. Luke stepped forward, carrying the oilcloth pouch. One by one, he placed each witness statement on the table. The old rancher from Miller's Ford, the stagecoach driver from Cottonwood Crossing, the native elder who remembered the creek long before fences divided the valley. Every testimony described the same water, the same course, the same history. Finally, Luke uncovered the weathered stone marker. The carved survey initials were still visible beneath the cleaned surface. Judge Whitman leaned closer. "Where was this found?" "Martha Cole can answer that." Martha calmly described the original location she had walked past for years. Elias Turner confirmed it. Luke explained how the buried marker proved the property line had been altered before the filing. Silence settled across the hearing room. Judge Whitman studied both maps side by side. Then he carefully rested one hand upon the old boundary stone. "This marker predates the recent survey." He looked toward Samuel Pike. "Do you wish to challenge these witnesses?" Samuel remained standing for several quiet moments. His shoulders slowly lowered. "No." The room became even quieter. He removed his gloves before speaking again. "I spent too many years believing stamped paper carried more weight than honest people." He looked toward Naomi. I was wrong. Judge Whitman closed the file. The original water rights remain with Iron Creek Ranch. The clerk recorded the decision. A single scratch of the pen settled months of uncertainty. By the time Luke and Naomi rode home, the first signs of spring had begun to soften Bitterroot Valley. Snowmelt filled Iron Creek once again. Water rushed beneath the repaired crossing exactly as it always had. Work returned to its familiar rhythm. Luke no longer slept in the bunkhouse. His shaving mug rested beside the washstand in the main house. His tools still hung neatly in the workshop, because every morning, long before sunrise, he walked the fences with a hammer over one shoulder. Some habits never needed changing. Others quietly became part of home. Elias Turner retired before summer. On his final afternoon, Luke and Naomi stood beside him at the front gate Luke had repaired on his first morning. You won't need an old foreman anymore, Elias said with a smile. Luke shook his hand. We'll always need your stories. A few weeks later, laughter echoed from the old storage building near the barn. The dusty grain bins had been removed. Fresh windows opened toward the pasture. Simple desks stood where hay wagons had once been parked. Naomi had turned the old warehouse into a small school for children whose families lived miles apart. Reverend Isaac Green visited often. One warm evening beneath the broad branches of the old cottonwood tree, neighbors gathered with folding chairs, homemade pies, and wildflowers picked from the creek bank. There was no grand ceremony, no expensive decorations, only familiar faces. People who had signed witness statements. People who had carried buckets during the fire. People who believed a ranch was measured by more than acres. Reverend Green smiled warmly. You've both spent months choosing this place. He looked at Luke. And choosing each other. Luke slipped a simple gold band onto Naomi's hand. She smiled through quiet tears. Not from sadness, from relief. 1 year later, the valley shimmered beneath a golden summer sunset. Luke and Naomi stood together on the hill overlooking Iron Creek. Below them, cattle crossed the clear water while children laughed near the schoolhouse. The repaired fences stretched across the pasture in long, straight lines. Luke rested both hands on the top rail. Still think this ranch is too big? Naomi leaned beside him and watched the herd move peacefully through the creek. She smiled. Not anymore. The evening lights stretched their shadows across the fence until they became one long silhouette reaching toward home. Iron Creek was no longer a place one person struggled to protect. It had become a home built by two people who chose to stay. Maybe that's why this story lingers long after the last sunset fades. It isn't really about fences, water rights, or even the land itself. It's about the quiet choice to remain when walking away would have been easier. Imagine standing where Luke stood that morning, believing your best years were already behind you. Or imagine carrying what Naomi carried, trying to protect a place filled with memories while wondering if you could keep going alone. Would you still trust someone enough to let them step inside your life? Would you stay when fear whispered that leaving was safer? Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand speeches. Sometimes it looks like a repaired gate, a warm cup of coffee waiting on the porch, a coat left beside the fire before dawn, or a hand that never lets go when the trail turns dangerous. Love has a quiet way of growing through ordinary days until one morning you realize you've found the family you thought you'd lost forever. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know what moment stayed with you the most. Share it in the comments. Someone else may read your words and find a little hope in them. And if stories like this remind you that kindness, courage, and second chances still have a place in the world, I hope you'll join me again. There are many more journeys waiting just beyond the next trail. Stories of healing, resilience, and unexpected love that I'd be honored to share with you.